Welcome to another Sunday night edition of Free Association Radio. My name is Robert Phoenix, and you have checked into FAR. And hopefully we're going to go far tonight. In a few minutes, I'm going to have my guest on. His name is Charles Ostman, and Charles and I go way back to the wild and woolly times of the mid-'90s, where there was a strange attractor called MONDO 2000 magazine that brought our lives together, and we travailed through the last days of MONDO and all the craziness and inspired madness that ensued with MONDO. And we're going to get to Charles in just a few minutes, and we're going to talk about his work and where he is and kind of where he sees things going, both from a what I would call a terrological perspective, meaning what's happening with the planet, and also from a technological perspective, what's happening with technology, and where these two forces collide, the organic and the synthetic, and where they match and where they don't match. And Charles has been on the front lines of this type of research for a number of years, and he's always got something interesting and at times even controversial to say. Some of you may be familiar with Charles in his experiences on the Coast to Coast show. He's been on there numerous times with both Art Bell and George Noory. He's no stranger to radio. We'll have him on in just a few minutes. But for now, just a little bit of housekeeping. As most people know, this is a show that is based on my website, which is mostly about astrology. On Sunday nights, we kind of drop the astrological perspective. We save that for midweek on Wednesdays. But today is the 11th of April, and whenever we have a show, I just want to give a few, sort of mentions and notices in terms of birthdays. And today, there's I wouldn't say it's a great day for birthdays. Tomorrow is a little more. There's that little white noise static which joined us when we had our friend Jay Widener on. Rachel Mussolini's birthday is today. I believe she's Benito Mussolini's daughter. So she's born in April 11th. That's fascinating. April being the sign of Aries, Aries being the god of war, and connected with Aryan culture and ultimately fascism. Happy birthday, Rachel Mussolini. And let's see, anybody else today of any interest or notes? Ethel Kennedy, I think she might be still alive, although I don't think so. But today is also the birthday of Anton LaVey, the father of Satanism. It's his birthday today. And anybody that follows sort of that strange world knows that there are a number of unusual associations that pop up around Anton LaVey, one of which obviously is Marilyn Monroe, or perhaps not so obviously if you don't follow that realm. Rumor has it that Anton LaVey was a piano player at a jazz and blues club at one point in time in Kansas City. And Marilyn Monroe met him in Kansas City before she was anybody, she was there to hang out and sing, and she met Anton LaVey, and apparently they had a relationship moving forward. Of course, Jane Mansfield, deeply connected and closely related to the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey. So Anton LaVey, his birthday is today. We also need, in terms of births, we need to at least mention one passing, and that one passing happened today on the 11th of April, and that's Malcolm McLaren. And Malcolm McLaren was the manager, handler, guru, Svengali for the Sex Pistols. And there probably would not have been anything that we know of resembling punk rock without Malcolm McLaren. And Malcolm McLaren had a fashion, he had a small shop. He was a haberdasher. And it was in London, and there was a whole pub rock scene, and out of the pub rock scene, Malcolm McLaren had kind of an S&M boutique, so to speak. Malcolm McLaren, Vivienne Westwood, all these early seminal punk rock figures were cutting their teeth in the world of fashion, and their fashion was all based on S&M and leather and exotica, and so the young Sex Pistols crew, people like John Lydon and Adam Ant, and even Boy George would frequent Malcolm McLaren's shop. And he basically kick-started the scene, started the Sex Pistols, and screwed a lot of record companies out of a lot of money because they would give the Sex Pistols their advance. The Sex Pistols would be too hot to handle, and they'd have the advance money, and the record companies would cancel the contracts. So I think Malcolm McLaren went through at least 3 record deals with the Sex Pistols, pocketed all that money, sent them off into the United States on their world-famous and Down in Flames tour. And then the Sex Pistols disbanded, and Malcolm McLaren had all the money. They had nothing. In Wonderland in San Francisco, on their final show, Johnny Lydon, a.k.a. Johnny Rotten, exclaimed, ever have the feeling like you've been fucked, more or less. And that was the final sentiment of the Sex Pistols. Malcolm McLaren went on to start Adam and the Ants and Bow Wow Wow. He was very, very influential, and he tried to turn himself into an artist. Buffalo Gals was the one track that he might be most noted for in terms of his own influence, which was a cross between a square dance call and hip-hop. But Malcolm McLaren is no longer with us, and no matter what you think of him, he was a force in the world of popular music, fashion, trend, and culture, and I'm sure Johnny Lydon is having a good chuckle tonight. He might have the last laugh. So, without much more further ado, I'm going to bring my guest in tonight. His name is Charles Ostman, and again, I met Charles back in the wild and woolly days of MONDO 2000, and if you don't know much about MONDO 2000, you're going to, because the editor, not the publisher, but the editor, Ken Goffman, a.k.a. Are You Serious, has engaged in a very deep and granular sort of retrospective of MONDO and what MONDO has done to our culture. It's going to be compiling kind of a best of MONDO online, and it'll have art and articles, and might have perhaps some crazy video that might be still around. It'll certainly have pieces, contemporary pieces of people that are part of the MONDO world. And Ken is diligently putting this together. And I wound up at MONDO 2000 in 1997, just at the edge of 96, 97. And Charles was one of the first people that I met at the MONDO house. In fact, he lived right down the street from the MONDO house. It was kind of like I guess it was like a clubhouse for psychedelic cyber misfits. They'd all kind of hang out there, and Queen Moo would make people food after she turned the refrigerator on during the day, or whenever she decided that the CIA wasn't using the refrigerator as a microphone. But MONDO 2000 was incredibly influential, and Charles's additions to MONDO in its final days were critical, because a lot of what was happening in the early part of MONDO was very theoretical. You had people like Rudy Rucker and Jaron Lanier and William Gibson, to a large extent, were talking about things that were theoretical. They were talking about things that were going to happen in the future of technology, in this convergence. And Charles was actually on the front lines. Charles was actually living the world that a lot of these guys were theorizing about. So without further ado, I want to bring on my good friend, old friend, Charles Ostman. How are you, Charles?
I'm alive and well, and I have to say, going from Sex Pistols to Satanism to synthetic biology, that's a pretty good stretch. I'm not sure they're all related, but
well, they all have the letter S. So think about
that's exactly right.
And the S sort of kind of resembles a serpent. So, but we won't.
Indeed so.
So how are you, my friend?
I'm alive and breathing, and being a biological machine of sorts, that's no small accomplishment these days. So yes, I'm alive and breathing, and it's good to hear your voice once again. And I think your description of MONDO was pretty apt. And for those that may not know, I was the so-called science editor, and I actually really did tried to bring little snippets or visions of that world into the world of MONDO to give it more of a kind of reality base. And I think in the last days of MONDO, it's maybe some of the best issues ever released. Not just because I was there, but I think it was a different kind of magazine.
It was.
Oh, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm just, what I tend to do is this could be one of my downfalls as somebody that does these things, but I tend to listen when people talk, and
No, I just heard a big buzz, and I thought maybe the line went dead or something.
Well, no, this could be, a couple of weeks ago I had Jay Widener on, and there was all kinds of shenanigans on this line. And generally when I'm doing this on Wednesdays by myself, or I have somebody that I would think is fairly benign, there's not a lot happening here. But every now and then, we've got elves in the machine, Charles, if you know what I mean.
Well, one time when I was on with Art Bell, we were discussing sort of the current state of the art in terms of biowarfare and biodefense. The line suddenly did start clicking, and there was a lot of weird pops and buzzes. I thought, well, maybe somebody's listening, but that's okay. And actually, as a sort of an odd aside, a lot of people do listen to Coast, and what surprised me was on one occasion, I got a phone call about 2 weeks later after one of my shows on the air from one of the directors at the FDA, and they actually flew me out to Rockport, Maryland, to give a 3-hour dissertation or presentation on what the current state there could be or should be, perhaps, in the world of nanoscale machines and medical applications. And I said, look, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm maybe not qualified. He said, that's okay. We just want to get your sense of this. And the reason they flew me out there was because at that time there was a real quandary. There still is, actually. But as you possibly well know, the FDA divides its regulatory activities in two main areas, two main domains, one of which is chemistry, that is traditional drugs, pharmaceuticals, and the other being equipment, machines, things that you would hook up to or, life support, that kind of thing, diagnostics, that sort of thing. And so where the role of nano comes in is we now have the ability, at least in some cases, to build very, very small, like cell-sized devices. In some cases, they are protocells, to use the literal sense of the word, that can be injected into the body or in some way attached to a chip or a device that is implanted, so that you really do have a merging of chemistry and machine at a sort of a nanoscale. So their whole vision was, how do we regulate this? What kind of protocol or what kind of regulatory protocol should we establish based on these emerging criteria? And after 3 hours of presentation, I gave them all kinds of, very detailed lectures on dendrimers and various types of nanoscale gold crystals with proteins attached and all kinds of interesting things. The final end of the takeaway message was, I said, look, folks, whatever you decide to regulate here, whatever new protocols are established, it may not matter that much because the United States is no longer in a position to really dictate or force the rest of the world to cater to its regulatory domain. And that's kind of a new thing. And I'm not sure they wanted to hear that, but that's what I told them because it's the truth. And in fact, even if it's not happening here, around the world, certainly in parts of Asia, parts of Europe, and Australia is a big player in this, the world of nanomedicine is moving very fast. So whatever the regulations are here, it's kind of almost a moot point because it's the world that's moving in this direction, not just one country or one body of regulatory compliance requirements.
Well, that's really interesting. So what comes to mind for me, Charles, is I part of my sort of philosophy, belief system, and experience of life is that this whole idea of countries is completely obsolete, and it is
obsolete. You're right about that. Yes.
It's a show that is given to the rest of us so that we have for lack of a better term, a teat, to hang on to. It's a nostalgic teat to hang on to.
Yeah, it's partly that, and also it gets a little more serious because when you start wandering to the world of international finance, one of my other hats, by the way, just for the sake of the audience perhaps, I wear a few hats, one of which is I sort of belong to a kind of a think tank called Institute for Global Futures, and we do a lot of strategic research for corporate clients and also for various agencies here and abroad. And the basic idea is that we look at the intersection of science and technology and how it affects our foreign policy. I'm hearing that buzz again. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. It's all right. This is what Jay.
They're listening, whoever it is. Yes.
It's just part of an initiation to be in my world, Charles.
I understand completely. That's quite all right. So again, the point is that we're looking at a global economy. We no longer have these kind of sovereignty zones where the economy of this one sovereign nation state sort of dictates economic policy around the world. It doesn't work that way anymore. And the place where that really becomes sort of interesting is in the area of intellectual property or IP. And there's probably no other area that's more contentious or more fluid than this sort of biopharma, genetic engineering, synthetic biology world, because the whole idea of owning a patent on a living thing is a very different territory, isn't it?
Well, if you go back in time, I think it probably was correct me if I'm wrong, mid-'90s or so, there was a judge who basically ruled that you could patent a living thing, which sent Monsanto and DuPont and all these other people scrambling down to the jungles of South America to start patenting a variety of plants and species.
Well, as a matter of fact, one of my sort of comrades from the past year was one of those people. He was actually in the Amazon. I've been to Brazil 4 times myself, actually. And he was actually collecting botanical specimens for precisely this purpose. They wanted to discover new kinds of potential pharmaceutical compounds that could be derived out of these various plants and that sort of thing. Actually, just for the sake of conversation, where the most lucrative or potentially interesting area is not in the jungles, but in the oceans. That's where you find the most interesting and diverse and really strange organisms that have completely strange metabolisms, but because of their strange metabolisms, you get these weird biomolecular systems that you can then extract from them and use them for other purposes. So actually the most sort of biopharma research is in the harvesting of things out of the oceans.
Interesting. Really interesting. Okay, so
in fact, that's where Craig Ventnor is. I mean, he's, as you may know, he was the private version of the Human Genome Project. He had a company called Solera at the time. In fact, I met Craig Ventnor and also Francis Collin, who was the director of NIH's, the government's version of the Human Genome Project. And these guys were blood enemies. I mean, they really had a, kind of a brutal, knockdown, drag-out fight because, the government version was it's going to take $10 billion and, 20 years and all these big schools are going to get these huge grants and everything. And Craig Ventnor said, no, listen, I'm a private, venture capital sort of guy. We can do this for $500 million and do it in 3 years. And in a way, they were both sort of right and wrong. It was a good experiment because it showed that the best answer really is when you have competition from both the public and private sectors, and they sort of do their own thing and then find out where the two meet. And that's really what happened. But I met the both of them at the Bio 2000 conference here in San Francisco, and it was quite an event because they had just cracked the genome. And I went to this private party. It was a kind of a celebration kind of deal. And this was the corporate bio IT world's biggest shindig. It was awesome beyond your wildest dreams. It was buckets of caviar and big ice statues and people in tuxes. And it was quite the thing. And I actually took home a plot of the entire human genome on this 8-foot-long poster. I still have it rolled up in my wall. But since that time, the world of determining what is proprietary and what is not, that's become a very strange territory indeed.
Are you and I proprietary right now?
Well, yes and no. The one thing I often say when I get in these discussions is we may be the last of our kind in the sense that, let me try a thought meme and see if this works for you. As you probably know, in earlier times, by legal definition, there were so-called acts of God, quote unquote. That is, things that cannot be covered or sanctioned under the domain of law in terms of things that would occur in the natural world, storms, various diseases, earthquakes, natural phenomena, the weather, whatever you might want to call it, for the sake of risk analysis and insurance and that kind of thing. However, those boundary points determining what is act of God versus what's act of man has become ever fuzzier. And one area where that's really true is in living things. And as we step into the arena of genetic modification, what's called genopharmacopoeia, and the concept of looking at one's genome to try to determine what your food is for various diseases and then developing potential remedies for that, even as they're being born, that kind of thing. We may be the last of the natural born human beings. We may be evolving into a world where it's going to be part syncoid and part humanoid. That's one way to look at it.
So we're on the horns of a dilemma as far as I can see it, Charles, because let's say, for instance, and you and I think we're going to get into, who drives what I would call the inherent morality around this.
Oh, yeah. I know this debate well. Sure, yeah.
But we're on the horns of a dilemma because the science is outpacing the judicial ability to rule
Correct.
on these things in a way.
That's correct.
Because judicial law comes out of an organic realm.
Well, and that's once again, forgive me for interrupting, but to make a point really well known, the whole idea of sovereignty is where this really comes into play, because whose jurisdiction is it? Even if a court here, let's just say with the latest passing of the bills in Congress and Senate to do with health care reform, et cetera, whatever you want to call it, we're stepping into a territory now where the government's going to be saying, this is the insurance you need and you have to buy this insurance and blah, blah. Okay, fine. Well, as a condition to get that insurance, it may be required that you have to have a genomic workup to determine what your proclivity is, or preconditioned perhaps from a genetic perspective, and that may determine the cost of the health care and access to employment and access to credit and all kinds of things, and maybe not now, but certainly years ahead. And yet, which jurisdiction has control over this? If we're living in a global economy and people's lives or career choices, et cetera, are being driven by their genetic footprint, then they'll go elsewhere in the world where the genetic footprint has a different kind of judicial control. So it's really because of a very fluid domain indeed.
Well, okay. So let's I mean, that you've just opened a whole can of worms there.
Gee, we're only 5 minutes into the show, but hey, that's okay.
Maybe I should have used a more synthetic analogy.
Fair enough.
You've opened a whole can of nanites.
Well, yes, indeed.
So all right. So now we've got the health bill, which is a whole other discussion unto itself.
Yeah.
It's given a huge amount of power now to various bodies inside the health, inside the government, inside the private care industry.
Yeah, I have real mixed feelings about this. Yeah.
It's called the medical industry for a reason, right? I mean, so here now you've got this whole set of guidelines that are going to evolve out of this decision. And you and I both know that whenever they bake this stuff, there's maybe about 70% of it that is black and white.
Yeah.
And there's another 30% that's kind of gray.
I would say it's more like 50-50 gray and black and white.
Okay,
it's a moving boundary point. I'll put it that way.
I was being hopeful, Charles. I was being optimistic, okay?
Okay, fair enough.
So 50-50. Now that gray area is there. Now what happens in that gray area is really, in a lot of ways, going to be determined not by our representatives, but by market forces. Am I right?
You're partially right. And market forces is itself kind of an odd domain. Let me see if I can throw a few data points in here to kind of give it more complexity, as it were. Because it's not just free market domain, like who's going to buy what healthcare. That's kind of irrelevant. What it really matters is what does the economic engine of the future have to rely upon to make its viability contiguous over some length of time. We all know that the number 2 driver for bankruptcy in today's world is the cost of healthcare. People are going bankrupt or losing their houses because they got charged some gigantic hospital bill because they couldn't get insurance coverage. So, I mean, there clearly was a reason for doing this. However, as we shift into this sort of new world, employers, the ability to make an income from a range of small to large businesses who are now going to have to take on a very different kind of roadmap to have compliancy, to not only be able to hire people, but to insure them and make sure they agree to all the appropriate compliancy codes. And then even the IRS now is going to be the enforcement agent to sort of make sure the compliancy is obeyed. This puts a very different kind of template on how these things are done. So people's career choices, even their educational paths, may be affected by what this emerging sort of health maintenance process persists. And that's something to be considered, because that directly affects the economy.
Charles, aren't we treading dangerously, though, to kind of a soft eugenics? I mean, let's look at it from an employer's perspective.
Sure.
So let's say we go down this path, and part of all of this is the genomic makeup.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And let's say the genomic makeup covers the fact that I might be open to having a heart attack before the age of 55.
Exactly right.
And now my employer or potential employer says to me, sorry, we have a long-term investment in you.
Right.
And now you're a potential risk for us in terms of investment.
This type of genomic mapping is exactly what I was talking about, and you got it right square center of target. And that could cover things like behavior patterns. It could cover things like proclivity for certain mental disorders or proclivity for addictive personality. I mean, these are all things that have genetic markers. These are already been sort of codified. So how far does one play this template out? And if companies are now sort of extending themselves into this new territory where sort of long-term risk analysis is part of the first stage in putting people into their sort of high-end career paths, this is exactly the kind of map that will probably be part of that process. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I'm old school, and I tend to think that humans have an immense amount of capacity to overcome trial and tribulation in their lives, be it physical or emotional, and to be sort of singled out and say, well, I'm sorry, we can't invest you long term, unless of course you go see our friends, over on the other side of town. In which case, they'll be happy to put a nano-driven regulator inside your heart.
Yeah. No, I see where you're going with this. I'll give you kind of the short version of this. One thing I do see, probably not too distant future, is when a baby is being born, when a baby's still in the womb, and a genetic makeup's already being worked up, before the baby comes out of the womb, the parents will be told, well, here's the map, here's the proclivity for these different diseases or different potential pathologies. I mean, this is sort of done now, but not with genetics. I mean, everybody knows that if you have certain characteristics in your family line, be it male or female side, dominant or recessive genes, they can kind of give a probability factor as to what your proclivity might be. And then once they refine this process to actual genetic mapping, you can be much more precise kind of way of doing this. So, I mean, at a certain point, this might become a requirement, to get your Social Security card, to get your other kinds of registration to fit into the larger scheme of things. It's going to be a requirement to have a certain genetic mapping. I'll give you kind of a strange example. As I was saying to you off the air, some friends of mine who used to live in my house, I rent part of my house out to visiting faculty, they actually gave birth to a baby in my house, which I thought was pretty cool, and they had midwives come over and everything. But part of their deal was they didn't want to have to go through the hospital / registration of all these different things. They wanted to keep their kid off the grid, as it were. And that's kind of a movement that's going on. There is a real, actual conscious effort among some to sort of stay off this grid, as it were, as much as possible, for however long that may be possible, and to what extent that becomes kind of irrelevant. That's hard to say. But it is a kind of an awareness people currently have. Now, the flip side of this coin is as follows. I mean, there are a lot of genetic diseases which are truly horrible. I mean, truly horrible. Lou Gehrig's disease, spinal bifida, the whole variety of neurological disorders. I mean, some things which are just truly hideous. And if one does have the capacity to recognize the potential for this as a baby's being born and then correct for it, that's a good thing. I mean, there is a positive side to this. But as
I agree. For the most part, I am more along the organic, carbonic, biological, evolutionary lines. But I also understand that there can be an interface at a very, very beneficent level between the type of technology that you're talking about and some of the really horrible disorders. And ALS, certainly you touched on them as one of them.
Yeah, ALS is a really horrible disease. So is MS. I mean, there's several diseases which are truly hideous, and they can be corrected. I'm all for it.
And I have a personal relationship to ALS because my ex-wife's mother passed away from ALS, and yet
my condolences. Yeah.
The amount of research and money that's devoted to ALS is dwarfed by cancer, and I don't even want to get into my relationship with cancer. My father just passed away from that recently, and it was a three-ring circus when it came to actually dealing with him.
Yeah, I understand.
I guess for me, Charles, and I just keep coming back for me, the organizing principle around all of this is who is driving the morality. What is the baseline? And here's the second part of that question for you.
Please. Yeah.
If there is what we would call a convergence, which is this ability to have technology and organic structures move more on a closer simultaneous track, there also is possibly a divergence, which is people that were in your house that gave birth to a kid that wanted to be outside of the matrix.
Exactly. Yeah.
So my question to you is twofold. One is what is the organizing principle that's driving the morality? And two, where do you see the convergence and divergence meeting and then moving apart?
And we only have an hour and a half. Okay, just kidding. But those are like what's the meaning of life kind of questions. But I'll do this as best I can in a small way. Couple of things. First of all, as we all know, there are diseases all over the world which cause horrible problems with poverty and just misery, quality of life. I mean, we Americans, through all of our troubles and disputes over mortgages going bad, whatever, still elsewhere in the world, it's very bad. I mean, we have a pretty good security net. And if I could be so bold, a lot of the difficulties that we see in terms of wars, terrorism, weird beliefs, whatever you want to call it, a lot of us stem from these horrible situations. And when people have hope, when they can get out of these horrible situations, then they no longer really find these fanatical, crazy ideas that are practiced. And one of the key vectors in that context is the invasion of these various diseases, many of which are extremely difficult to deal with by traditional pharmaceuticals because it's too expensive and too complex to work with drugs. On the other hand, if these things could be eradicated by genetic, that's a positive thing. The cost to our economy here, because of people getting like Alzheimer's or dementia, other things like this, where people simply lose their mental faculties before their physical faculties. Again, these are things that could be dealt with genetically. So, I mean, there is a positive side to that. The flip side says, is there a ruling body or is there a consortium where public opinion can insert itself so that there's some kind of a guidepost or some kind of a framework that people can relate to? The challenge here is that these are technically very complex topics. So trying to get the general public to connect to this level of science is very, very challenging. It's more like an education problem as opposed to a knowledge problem.
But yeah, it does make sense, and I think in some ways, I don't want to infer that you would belong to any one group, just straight out of the gate. But for me, one of the things that I feel like science, and maybe rightly so, is that the people in the scientific community have an extreme top-down perspective on sort of the rest of humanity, and maybe it's because of their training and background and intelligence, and it gives them kind of a real vertical perspective. But at the same time, I mean, we all came out of the chute. We're all
exactly.
Carbon and blood, and we all have the same processes. So we all have a horizontal relationship to our own matrices for now, at least.
I'm going to throw out a really strange curveball just because it's a show that allows that kind of thing, so why not? In my humble opinion, having spent many, many years with the Department of Energy and having spent many years with folks at NASA and having seen quite a pretty broad swath of things that affect the world, climate change, quality of life, the potential for life being what it could be versus what it is now, et cetera, probably the number one negative driver is overpopulation. I mean, that's not going to sit well with a lot of folks for religious reasons. I do get that. But if I could be so bold, I would offer the idea, theoretically at least, I think it would be an improvement if the population could be held at its current level, even reduced a little bit, but the quality of life would simply be increased much more. Now, is that really possible? Probably not, for obvious reasons, cultural, if nothing else. But in an ideal world, that's what you'd like to be shooting for. You'd like to be shooting for probably less dense populations, but populations where the quality of life is as good as it could possibly be. And whether or not we have the wisdom to use the current set of tools to get to that end goal, that's a very open debate and probably not possible, at least in our world. I would suggest to you that if one believes that life exists in other worlds, and I think it does, there's probably been quite a few examples of Earth-like planets that have gone through this very moment where they got to a certain point where they saturated the Earth's population carrying capacity. They're at the very edge of sort of suppressing the life support capacity in the future in terms of consumption of non-renewable resources, and they have a very short window of time in which to make these crucial decisions. And unless the majority of the world's populations could sort of see things on the same level and then agree to kind of go forward for the better reasons, they probably perish. And that may be part of what our design strategy is. In other words, we kind of have to go through a series of these evolutionary tests. As you've heard me say before in previous talks, excuse me, I tend to view evolution as a kind of a trauma-induced process. That is, given the trauma cycles or periodicity and amplitude don't exceed the system capacity to respond, the system does sort of come back more robust. That tends to work like a fractal with all different scales. And so on a planetary scale, we as a civilization, we're at this very edge where we sort of know, we can see most of the jigsaw puzzle being assembled before us. We kind of know that if we just go the way we're going, we're probably going to do ourselves in, not with warfare, but just by simply draining their planetary resources and probably creating some really terrible situations in terms of the planet itself. So can we willingly decide to, en masse, kind of go to collective direction that says this is the better way to go? That's our open question mark, and that's probably more of a question than the actual technology itself.
Well, you've been around high technology for a number of years. I mean, you do business with people that that remain nameless for good reasons because you have contractual obligations with them. And I'm sure that you have seen or at least heard of technology that most of us are not even remotely aware of. And my question,
in some cases, true. Yes, in some cases, true. Yes,
okay, so my question to you then, Charles, is: are we dealing with a controlled paradigm in which that technology is being held back for a specific reason? And if it is, can't that technology be used in service of kind of liberating, what is it, the 6 billion people that are on the planet now, and improving the quality of life?
Yeah. Well, there's some dark stuff, and then there's some lighter stuff. So the dark stuff first, maybe just to kind of start off on a tangent. I mean, some people have talked about things. Well, there's something called proteomic targeting. Let me start with that. And proteomic targeting means that if, for instance, for dealing with cancer, this is the number one issue right now. And just to make it very straightforward, cancer basically is the situation where you have cells that have lost their genetic identity or affinity with these cells that they want, with the tissue that they want to eliminate from. So when you have a tumor, when you have leukemia, or other kinds of cancers, the cells start to reproduce on their own, and they have a different physiology and a different proteomic signature. So the theory is, I mean, right now, for instance, if you have most of these different kinds of cancers, the best you can hope for is chemotherapy like methotrexate or one of these truly awful drugs. And the theory is to kill off a bunch of cells, and hopefully a few of the good ones still survive to kill off all the bad ones. But that's a pretty bad. That's not a very good way to go.
The odds are not stacked in your favor.
Yeah, methotrexate and those kinds of things is a pretty. I mean, the treatment's almost as bad as the disease.
Yeah.
However, by extreme contrast, if one could have a particular kind of molecule, like a dendrimer, for instance, which is this branchy looking, it looks like a little tree sort of thing, and you can decorate the outside of it with different kinds of proteomic compounds that will match a very specific genetic signature, and then when that dendrimer, for instance, communicates chemically with the cancer cell in question, it'll then open up and squirt into it a protein like P43 that'll actually turn the cell off and say, okay, stop doing your thing. That's very good because you can precisely target just the bad cells, and then everything else is left alone. So this is a very good application for proteomic targeting. However, the exact same mechanism could also be used for something really awful, like a bioweapon that would be racially selective or selective on some other genetic marker. And those things have been talked about.
Well, not just talked about. I mean, I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, Monsanto has actually created a seed.
I don't want to comment on Monsanto exactly, but I will say that I have been to a number of biodefense-related conferences, and I have seen our attempts to counteract against that kind of thing. I'll just put it that way. I mean, it's a known thing, and the people are trying to deal with how to respond to such a thing we're to be encountered. I'll go that far.
Speaking of seeds, what do you make of Bill Gates and the whole Svalbard seed vault? What's your take on that?
I think the seed vault's a great idea. I mean, look, if all heck breaks loose and we just don't make it, and it could be anything. I personally feel, by the way, people have talked a lot about nuclear weapons and that kind of thing. For example, I look at Pakistan as being a very fragile situation. If Pakistan were to suddenly go, just fall apart in civil war, and a few nukes got in the wrong hands, it could be very bad. But that would actually be fairly minimal compared to a biological, which, if it was released and spread like a pandemic, and was one of these designer bugs that nobody had a map for, the way this works is you have a catalog of known phenotypes that, if you know what the bad bug is, you can detect it pretty quickly and then develop some kind of antidote or some kind of way of responding to it. The problem is when you have these designer bugs where there is no genetic sort of code for it and you don't know what it is, first to determine, what is it exactly, and then what's the pathology associated with it, and then how do you deal with it. So if there is a designer bug that was released somewhere in some context and was some mixture of hantavirus that was airborne, aerosol dispersant, and caused death in 24 hours or something, it could be pretty bad. And if it involves some kind of proteomic targeting mechanism, so they're only going after a certain range of people with a certain genetic footprint, that kind of thing could happen. And then, of course, if that mutated, it could wipe out a good portion of the Earth's population. In my mind, that's probably the worst of the worst. And the thing about biologicals that gets my attention is, unlike nuclear, where you can detect nuclear, you can sense it from a distance. I won't go into details, but it is possible to determine if there's something nuclear even pretty far away. Biologicals, on the other hand, can be totally sealed up, and you could be sitting in a room with a jar full of something right next to you, wouldn't even know it was there. And to kind of give you a little glimpse of that idea, I actually had a chance to spend about 4 hours with Dr. Ken Allebeck. And Ken Allebeck wrote a very famous book called Biohazard. He was the supreme director of biowarfare development for the former Soviet Union. He answered directly to Gorbachev before the Soviet Union dissolved. And now he's a consultant in Washington, D.C. So, there's a lot of people out there who sort of know this. And what's interesting about, if you read the book Biohazard or, research this, but they had metric tons of all kinds of horrible things. These solutions. They would essentially inoculate these various bad bugs in eggs. That's how it's normally done. And then they would break the eggs open and make a sort of a slurry out of it and store it in various ways. And out in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which is where this stuff is being done, there were, barrels and drums full of this stuff sort of laying around after the Soviet Union dissolved. Now, who knows where that stuff may have gone to? And that's the kind of thing that worries me, is that, even a small amount of that kind of stuff in the wrong hands could be very, very bad. So in a way, a lot of this pandemic research and a lot of the sort of biodefense work is, I think, extremely important, because if something like that is released, we have to have some way of dealing with it. We have to have some way of theoretically testing for variations of those types of pathogens as they're released.
Well, fair enough. I'd agree with that. I mean, at least for the Cold War, theoretically, right? I mean, you were dealing with game theory, and you were dealing with weapons of mass destruction. And
you're also dealing with people who were logical. In other words, look, let me give you an example. This might be sort of interesting. When I was at Los Alamos for a couple of years, back when Reagan took over from Carter, and I was working on a big laser, now declassified, called Antares. It was a big, giant, kind of like a Star Wars laser. In fact, it was part of the Star Wars program. And our mission was to be able to target and neutralize incoming multiple reentry vehicle warheads, or MIRVs as they're called. Now, back when I was at Los Alamos, I remember very clearly one day sitting with a couple of my comrades there, and I was saying, we've got some of the best technology on the planet, some of the most interesting people you could possibly find. We're spending all this money on these giant lasers and the other things that we're developing. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could not do this, but do something more useful instead? And, it's kind of just a wild thought on my part. Well, 25 years later, literally 25 years later, I was giving a talk in Virginia to this sort of Nano Tech and energy conference, and I was approached from a fellow in the audience who came up to after I gave my talk, and he said, well, look, I'm working on something called the IPP, or Initiative for Proliferation Prevention. And I said, what's that? And he explains, and what it was, or what it still is, this was a program, after the Soviet Union dissolved, they had literally thousands of PhD scientists who were looking for work. I mean, they closed down a lot of their black laboratories, and they were trying to convert to peaceful technology. So they wanted to bring over these Soviet scientists and hook up with venture investors here so they could develop, peaceful things. So I went to this conference a year later in Philadelphia. Here I'm at this big trade show with 10,000 people and all kinds of displays and things. And I'm working with a group called Fourth Venture, who specializes in that kind of east-west technology convergence stuff. So I was on the floor, and I met these three guys. They developed this very beautiful wind turbine, which, by the way, is right here in California now. It turns out these were the head designers of the very missiles, the very warheads, from the Makiyev State Rocket Facility in the center of Russia at that time. The very guys whose machine we were trying to shoot down, I met them in person and shook their hand. And we, through a translator, we were talking back and forth. And it was like the most bizarre, unexpected sort of dream suddenly coming true. So, I mean, even though it sounds kind of Pollyannish, these things do happen. We kind of got past that point. But the point I was hoping to make was what I found out when I was talking with these Soviet scientists and a lot of their other people with them. These folks are just like us. They have families. They care about life. They care about the planet. They're not crazy folks. They were just doing as they were told, and they were given a certain kind of agenda to fulfill, and they were doing their thing. What we have in the current world is something very different. We have small groups, not associated with the nation state, who are driven by fanatical ideology as opposed to a traditional sort of religious paradigm or a political paradigm. So that's a much more difficult target to kind of deal with. It's called asymmetrical warfare. And that's the thing that's scary, because there is no centralized, there's no ruler, there's no politburo, there's no traditional, pathway of treating. You're dealing more with like warlords and bands of fanatics driven by religious ideology. It's a very different kind of situation, and that's why we have to take a different kind of response to it.
So in the quote unquote conspiratorial world, or the exopolitical world, right? They would take your scenario and say that 80% of what you're talking about is controlled opposition, meaning that they've been set up to be sort of agents provocateurs in the world, so they can actually drive the industrial military complex marketplace. In fact,
I do to a certain extent. I kind of agree with that. I mean, certainly when it comes to oil and pipelines and getting geopolitical intrigues to go to your favor so you can get some new territory or minerals or whatever. I understand that kind of stuff. I'm quite familiar with it. But I think at this point it's gotten to be so chaotic that those kinds of traditional models really don't work. There may be some who believe they work, but I think that it's gotten to the point where even those who would like to contrive those kind of machinations, the old world paradigm just isn't working as it once had. We live in a real-time world where everything's sort of interconnected. People know about what's happening halfway around the planet as it happens. a very small group of folks can actually create something very terrible just because they feel like they want to do so. Now, are there people from the inside, as it were, who want to use those kinds of groups to suit their own purposes? Yes, there are, of course. But all I'm trying to suggest to you is that the predictability. In other words, if you're trying to instigate some kind of localized conflict or some kind of war or some kind of event to happen so you can gain the upper hand, you want to have a pretty reasonable assurance that the risk exposure is going to be minimal and you're guaranteed a pretty high percentage of success. In this kind of a format, though, that's a real wild card. There's a 50-50 chance in many cases. And so even those kind of folks on the inside, I think, are not that willing to take a risk as they might once have been. That's just a guess on my part, but that's how I see it.
So Charles, how do scientists and researchers really feel about the layperson?
I'm sorry, Susan, I couldn't quite hear that.
So scientists and researchers, what are their feelings towards, quote unquote, the rest of us? How do they really feel about kind of the layperson outside of the scientific world?
I think that the general, from all the people I've ever worked with, and this covers a pretty broad range, I think that they want to see a better world, but they also realize that realistically it's a world that's getting overpopulated. That seems to be the number one sort of thought. And let me give you one other slice of this pie, not to get too far in this one tangent, but if you look at economic systems, excuse me, I'm so sorry, I'm battling a cold here. Speaking of biology, my own biology is kind of questionable, but I'll hang in there as long as I can. Excuse me. The basic idea is this, that for an economic system to work, you have to have a certain amount of productivity, got to have a certain amount of employment, you have to have a way to have the majority of your population, 90% or better, actually functioning in that economic engine. What you have now, though, are huge pockets of people sprinkled around the world that have no connection to any of this. They're not part of an economic system, they're not manufacturing anything, they're not doing anything, they're just sort of there. And they have to be supported by the rest of the world that has to keep their existence kind of functioning somehow. And I know that sounds kind of weird, and I don't mean to sound Malthusian, that's not where I'm going at all, but I'm saying as a practical matter, for people to be able to have a quality of life where they're not driven to extreme fanatical beliefs and all the stuff that brings, they have to have some way of fitting into the global economic system in some context. That's the real challenge, is that today, I mean, if you go to Sri Lanka, for instance, and certain parts of Asia, and, Africa is probably the worst example, but you have these huge populations where there's nothing there. There's no economic system that could even potentially get them into a more productive way that everybody has a fair shot at having a good life. That's the current date now. And if the populations keep growing in certain ways as they are, it could just get much worse. And I mean, to me, it just seems like you have to kind of come with a series of trade-offs. And that's probably the most difficult one that has the biggest sort of moral question mark.
Well, coming from a non-scientific perspective, which is what I often do, although I do try to keep up on as much science as possible, not to the degree you do, obviously. But for me, I mean, the real hammer and the nail is the global debt. And, if the people that were really invested in creating a much more platonic world where we can all share in this wonderful experience together,
I understand.
All they'd really have to do, Charles, is just let go of the debt. And
well, in a way, yes, and in a way, no. I have a theory about this, and this is strictly theory, but as I said, I've spent a lot of time in various think tanks. Another think tank that I work with, by the way, is something called Millennium Project. You might be interested in this. And they publish a State of the World book every year, and I've been in like 4 of these now. And they have these like 15 great challenges of the world, and they list these 15 major challenges as the primary drivers that change state of the world's health from a planetary perspective and where civilization might go in the future. And I guess the criteria is this, that about in the mid-'80s, what's called the point of sustainable equilibrium passed. That is, there was a point where the world could support everybody on it in a healthy economic way. And it was from that point that it started to go downhill. Now, some people have theorized, and I might partially buy into this, that here in the United States, the sort of ground zero for capitalism, as it were, there were those in Wall Street and those elsewhere that were part of the Wall Street conundrum, who figured out that, okay, the United States is going to sort of collapse at some point. The Western economy, as we sort of know it to be, is going to have to go through a planetary scale reset. So we're just going to take everything we can and sort of, we're going to create this gigantic Ponzi scheme with these fake mortgages and these weird derivative interest rates and all those things, and pop as much money as possible because we see the end coming, and then we're just going to go for it while we can. And in a weird kind of way, that is kind of how history has turned out. I don't know if it's true, but that's kind of a theory that does have some credibility to it.
has a lot of credibility to it, but it's still, I mean, for me, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Yeah.
And there's a point when you get towards the upper part of the pyramid where we're no longer concerned about our material well-being or our safety. We're now able to luxuriate in more abstract processes and begin to contemplate the nature of the universe and God and these wonderful things that people who have a lot of leisure time on their hands can do. And,
well, maybe not so much leisure time, but at least the ability to extrapolate beyond the
right. I mean, they're just not bound by the same rules of survival. I mean, they're not rummaging around a pile of fish heads, outside of a lake in North Africa in order to survive. I mean, so for me, it's like I think if there was a real concerted effort to turn the tide on the planet, this is just my perspective.
Sure.
That there would be a combination of applied science and, in equal measure, applied humanity. When I say applied humanity, I'm not talking about some sort of false humanity. I'm talking about let's wipe out the debt, let's take the burden off all these poor people around the globe, of which, by the way, many Americans are now quickly joining the ranks of.
No, I agree with you. I mean, first of all, I had a chance to have a brief bit of a chat with John Perkins, who, of course, wrote the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. A friend of one of my former girlfriends, her sister works for the publishing company that put this guy into print. So, I mean, I had sort of a weird inside connection to it. But this was a guy who was the exact sort of evil as you were talking about earlier. The modus operandi was to go mainly into Africa and find these weird countries and force them into these gigantic projects through the World Bank, through the IMF, to build a gigantic dam or a big highway or something they really didn't need, but they would just, sort of lure them into these giant projects. And then once the country went to debt, they would come in and say, well, I'll tell you what, since you can't pay off this debt, we want your timber, or we want your uranium mine, or we want your, fill in the blank, whatever the thing was that they wanted. And that's how a lot of these operations worked. I mean, these countries are forced into horrible debt situations. I mean, really horrible. Exactly. And that's why you see in the Congo, in Nigeria, and, Sierra Leone, and all these different places where you have these just god-awful, Zambia and Zimbabwe now, I mean, these just horrible, hell on earth nightmare kind of places, was really the artifact of these crazy schemes. And these came out of Wall Street. These came out of these sort of government operatives with their Wall Street companions, and they would come up with these weird schemes to put these people into forced debt. And now the same trick's been played here in the United States. I mean, see how I mean? So, I mean, that is evil. I mean, that's hardcore evil. Now, how do you unravel that and get to a larger consensus where people say, wait a minute, this has gone beyond just bad things. You're going to hurt the planet and life in general. And I think you're right. There is kind of a corner being turned. And I do sense that. I mean, I have these conversations all the time. One other thing I might throw in there just for the 2 cents worth, over the past decade or so, I've spent a fair amount of time working with different venture capital groups trying to get different startup companies to have different funds. And in the past, 7 or 8 years, I saw a really dramatic change, where the interest wasn't just how much money you could make in a short amount of time, but really was the industry in question something that was green, was it something that could be sort of used not just because it's a good industry, but because it actually would help improve the quality of life and have sort of a larger picture kind of sense to it. And I saw this change myself personally, and it was quite something actually. So I mean, I have seen this effect take place. Whether it can happen to a large enough scale in unison around the world, that's sort of an open question mark, but that change is happening.
So that's good. I mean, so here's my cynical nature kicking in. All right.
Sure.
My cynical nature is the host is realizing, or the parasite is realizing that the host is sick.
Exactly right. That's precise. Robert, you hit the word. You had a beautiful metaphor. That's exactly where it's going to go. That's exactly right. Because when a virus or a microbe invades a living thing, eventually the host dies, and people begin to realize the host is dying. That's exactly right. You couldn't have said it better.
Self-sustainability in and of itself is not altruistic. It is exactly. It's a selfish proposition, really.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, interesting. So I want to ask you about some scientific stuff. I mean, we've talked about theoretical morality, all that. Let's get down to brass tacks because I think.
Okay. Well, the thing that's most interesting that I was hoping to sort of steer towards tonight, perhaps. There's several things happening, but the one that's kind of top of the list for me, at least, is a sort of intersection between nanotech and biotech, what I call nanobiology. And in the world of nanobiology, there's a subset of that now called synthetic biology. And this is the ability to literally build organisms on the fly as they need it. And you're thinking, well, why would that be useful? Well, think about it for a minute. A lot of manufacturing processes, like manufacturing computer chips or things of that nature, electronic devices, requires really huge, highly centralized, very expensive, and very complex machinery, as well as using an enormous amount of resources, including making a huge carbon footprint and water to run these kind of facilities. By doing contrast, can one grow, microstructures or nanostructures with the same useful properties, but without these gigantic industrial facilities to make them possible? And at the same time, can one use the same mechanisms to create things only as they're needed, as opposed to having to create gigantic volumes of these things and sell them in mass and justify the cost? That's kind of where this could be going, and that's what I see right now.
It's the Walmart model, isn't it? It's like
it's the Walmart model using biology. Exactly. And so in that context, there's something called the. By the way, for all those folks that might be interested, you can go to something called synthetobiology.org. That's probably the largest sort of centralized portal for all different conferences and events and publications. And by the way, if you go there, I go there pretty often myself, you'll find a fair number of conferences held here in Europe and elsewhere that really deal with ethics. And they actually talk about ethical considerations. And they're actually, in fact, by the way, the Millennium Project, headed by Jerry Glenn, who I've known for many years, one of his ideas, and I kind of agree with this actually, he sort of wants to form kind of like a scientific version of the United Nations. The United Nations is maybe a questionable example because it's highly corrupt, but let's just say we could skip that for a minute. If there was because, scientists are not stupid. They tend to be able to see the larger picture. I mean, some scientists, I agree, get caught up with the myopia of trying to win the big prize or trying to get ahead. Academic politics is very, very vicious sometimes. And so sometimes you get so caught up in academic politics, you kind of forget about the larger picture. Sometimes people do bad things because they're not thinking right. But the majority of most scientists I've ever met really do see the larger picture. And they understand that if the organism dies, we all lose. Right. So there is an effort to try to create kind of a scientific version of a United Nations. That is, there would be a global body of authorities in very different disciplines. They would then kind of look at new technologies as they're coming online and say, okay, these are the parameters that should be employed to make this more acceptable. The real trick is to get international trade agreements to match with these sort of scientific protocols. And the wild card here is China, because I don't want to bash China too much, but they're kind of a wild card. They really don't see maybe their sense of ethics is different than ours, but they don't play the same game that we do. There is, we're the new rising power. We don't care what it takes. We're going to get there. We're going to be the new, entity. I mean, the vision is, as you probably all know, in the Asian culture in general, they tend to think in long term. They, 10, 20, even 50-year plans is nothing. That's normal. That's their consistent way of, 5,000 years of history.
Calendar, yeah, definitely.
And whereas here in the United States, it's just like quarterly returns and, election cycles. So it's like two extremely different mentalities. So in their context, what they see is, look, even if we have to do a lot of questionable things to get there, we're going to get there, and then maybe later we can take the world to level. For right now, we're on the way up, and so we're going to get there no matter what. And some people have said, well, the United States was like that 50 years ago. So, could there be an argument there? Well, yes, but the problem is that in today's world, we don't have the luxury of being able to be sloppy and messy and cause a lot of damage because the world's not going to be able to tolerate much more damage. It's already pretty damaged as it is. So can we come up with a way to have China to be relatively open and transparent and able to connect to a international body that would establish scientific protocols based on some kind of ethical parameter? That's unknown, and that's where I'd say the question could be.
You know what I was thinking of as you were talking about this? I was thinking about the crisis that the Catholic Church is currently undergoing.
Oh, yeah.
And so,
excuse me.
Literally, billions of people around the world, the Catholic Church has been the social conscience for their communities and their cultures and their lives. And theoretically, it would be the moral reflection that would have been held up towards the quantum leap that science is making. It's like, here is your baseline morality shared by 65% of the world's population. And now that baseline morality is deeply in question because of what's going on. And what we're looking at really, in a lot of ways, right, is it's like right of a Dan Brown novel.
It's kind of like a miniature version of this on a larger scale. I understand what you're getting at. And maybe one thing to throw in, and a lot of my friends are Catholics, so I want to be careful here because there are a lot of good people in the Catholic faith who actually do a lot of good charity work, and I don't want to be completely washing with a broad brush. But the one thing I have a real complaint with in the church in general is that in many areas of the third world, businesses like the fellows surrounding Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where you have this horrible poverty. I mean, poverty that you can't even imagine in America. And the thing is, if the Catholic Church comes in there and says you cannot have birth control, you cannot have family planning, you can't even have contraception, you must give birth to these children no matter how they're born or what situation. And that just causes horrible nightmares as an end result. And yet this has been the traditional method for empires to remain powerful for centuries, for millennia actually. In other words, up until recently, when the world was wide and life expectancy was pretty low, and most of the world lived in a rural economy, farming, that kind of thing, you needed to have a large population to become powerful. The modus operandi, the number one ticket for being powerful was I've got a bigger population than you do. I can build a bigger army. I can grow more food, I can dominate shipping lanes, whatever it is. And that works for 1,000 years right now. And so, when you have, the world of Islam and you have the world of main Christianity, as it were, who are both trying to outpopulate each other because that's their only way they know to sort of stay powerful, it's a really hard argument to kind of put in their picture because they can't seem to get out of a paradigm that has lasted for centuries, and it's a hard thing to give up. So that's one of the main criteria that I sort of look at. I mean, the stuff about the child molesting, that's just kind of a side issue. I see this as actually the larger issue.
I agree with you. No, I totally agree with you. I mean, if you look at what the Catholic Church has done for years, they have worked in concert with empire, and it didn't matter whether the empire was British and Reformed Catholic Church. Didn't matter whether it was empire and it was Spanish or Italian. But it was empire, and what empire needed was bodies.
That's right, lots of bodies. Yeah.
A lot of bodies. It needed numbers. It needed numbers to shape the land and eventually work in the factories for slave wages. But for me now, and I keep coming back to this point, Charles. Forgive me if I.
No, it's all right. Go ahead, please.
I see where we have gotten to this certain point, right? I mean, we've gotten to this point, what I would call the economy of leisure. And the economy of leisure means that right now I've got a flat screen TV in my room. I've got a car. I've got gas. I've got a satellite. I have basically enough food to stay alive. And it has reached in a lot of ways in this country, and I say this country specifically, a level of critical mass.
Yeah, well, it is reaching critical mass. And what's interesting is that in China, you now have, for the first time ever in its entire history, you have a very rapidly growing middle class. And just like you're saying, people there, they want to have cars, they want to have TVs, they want to have iPods, they want to have designer jeans. And China realizes that unless they have a growth curve that's like almost a vertical line, they can't keep the middle class happy. And for them, it's a race against time. In other words, as long as the working class feels they have a shot at a better life and that their kids can get into a better education and the quality of life has some kind of potential light at the end of the tunnel, even though life's still pretty bad for many cases in China, that's the whole point. They have the promise. They dangle it like a carrot in front of them and say, look, if you work harder and do all these things, you'll eventually have this American lifestyle that you're even better than American. That's what they promise. And whether they'll get that far, who knows? But that is this mythical goal that everybody tries to shoot for as a political agenda. To say, if you just do this, then this will be the reward. And you're right. The American standard of life is sort of the icon of that theoretical reward.
Yeah, I mean, the cynical part of me is that we've helped build empire, both abroad and domestically. We've helped, and when I say empire, I'm talking about industrial empire.
Yeah.
And now that we've reached this point of the economy of leisure, that the next level would be to encroach on the, and even though it's a big stretch, but to encroach on the porch steps of the oligarchy. And the oligarchy don't really want anybody to encroach on their porch steps.
No, they don't. That's exactly right. They don't.
So what we'll do is we'll have the economy of leisure, but at a certain point, it's like, okay, that's enough. Thank you. Thanks for playing. You've helped us amass this wealth, and now we're going to shift the paradigm, whether you like it or not.
And that could happen. I mean, I'm not one to say yes or no. It's one of those great questions. But if we want to, we can go back to science, because, I mean, there's a lot to be said for what's going on. I think one of the areas that I'm most intrigued by and the area that I would be most interested in spending effort on, and I've been doing a little bit of it myself, It's this idea of sort of linking together quantitative and biases. That is, this concept that, well, this is some kind of strange, walk us through a little bit. Do you know about something called the Global Consciousness Project, or GCP?
I do, actually.
Okay, good. And so this was Roger Nelson and his son. I've met both these folks several times. And there's something called the IONS Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California. It's about an hour's drive from here.
I've been there. Yep.
Yeah, exactly so. And just for the audience, what happens there, what they've been doing is, for about a decade or so now, they've had a bunch of these random number generators sprinkled around the world, hooked into a global network that goes back to a central processing system at Princeton. And the reason this is interesting is because, and not to get into some boring math stuff, but just in basic terms, randomness is a very difficult thing to prove mathematically. I was working in crypto a little bit at one point, and so when I was working in crypto, the very first thing I learned about was how to prove perfect randomness, because any crypto system has to rely on really, really extreme randomness for its crypto keys. So a lot of effort went into creating all kinds of really exotic systems so that there could be, as little order as possible. And basic chaos theory goes as follows. You can look at any chaotic system. I don't care whether it's sand on the beach or stars in the sky or, I don't know, any kind of mishmash you can think of. And no matter how random it appears to be, if you one backs away far enough to a higher, larger field of view, there will be emergent order. So in a way, if you're going to look for evidence of quantum entanglement on a mass scale, what you'd be looking for is a shift in randomness so that emergent orders are sort of popping into another randomness knowing for. So that was the basic theory. And the idea was that if there is a kind of a physics of consciousness sort of realm that can be proved or at least shown by experiment, one way to show that would be to observe the change in randomness affected by mass consciousness. And as anybody who's a little bit familiar with quantum physics will tell you, the actual process of observing quantum entanglement actually changes the entanglement nature. So it's kind of a hard thing to witness directly, but one can indirectly imply its function by some other mechanism. So that's why these RNGs were set up around the world. And as it so happens, about 80% of the time, there's a very noticeable effect that goes beyond 50% or beyond this random chance. And by the way, just for the record, the largest change in randomness that was ever measured was the actual 9/11. The second largest was the tsunami that happened in Thailand in December 2005. And by the way, the Obama election was about number 6 or 7 on that list. And anyone can go there, by the way. You can go to the GCP site and download the data, and you can look at it yourself. It's all open for anyone to look at. So, I mean, in a way, it's a kind of a beginning edge of another area of science. But I think maybe the most important area of science there is, because for the past hour or so, we've been talking about political things and economic forces and things that kind of change our life to do with our being on the planet. But if we could harness and apply the potential of collective consciousness as a sort of instrument influence, that, in my humble opinion, is the way that we're going to make change. It's not going to happen with elections and going through Congress and committees and worldwide, agreements and whatever. That stuff kind of works, but it's very slow and it's very clumsy and it's very porous and it's full of corruption. This, on the other hand, gets around that entire process. And excuse me, speaking of biology, sorry about that. As we progress as a species, as we go down this evolutionary pathway, it's my belief that other civilizations elsewhere actually went through this process and sort of stumbled into this or figured it out in advance, but we're able to get beyond the limitations of socio-political processes and work directly with this kind of empathic linkage. And if that's the case, then could it be possible for a certain percentage of the world's population to drive or push, as it were, even if the rest of the population doesn't even know it's happening, could one build a mechanism that would affect the state of mind, the state of consciousness of the rest of the world? And that actually is a possible doable thing. That's the science I would like to be working on. I think there's some evidence to show this is possible.
Charles, this is what I love about you, and this is why I wanted to have you on the show.
Well, thank you.
No, seriously, because I know that you're a guy that traffics in some really hard science and some really defined parameters and defined worlds and defined agreements. And on the other hand, you're also somebody that really senses this noetic possibility, and not from any agenda, but from really kind of an internal and authentic place. And that's what I've always liked about you. And I'm glad you brought this whole proposition up, because I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah.
And I would just, I would love to know, how we get from here to there. I mean, that's really, that's the piece.
Yeah, and here's a few thoughts about this. I mean, one of the areas that's really been big on my list of things to look at, and I've been working with a bit, the world of neurophysiology has really moved very fast, very quickly. There's actually several companies. There's one called NeuroSky. You can actually buy a little headset, and you can drive computer games now with your thoughts. There's another company called Emotive. They have a much more high sort of caliber version of this. In other words, if you remember the movie Firefox, you may recall this. This came out a few years ago. It starred Clint Eastwood, and basically the premise of the movie was he snuck into the Soviet Union and stole this high-tech plane, like an SR-71, their version of it kind of thing. And he flies it out of Russia and flies it back over here, but he had to think the commands to get the plane to do its thing. And he had to think in Russian, no less. It's kind of an interesting plot line. But the whole point was, the premise of that film was actually quite realistic. I mean, it was a little bit overly done, but the general concept was there. And then, of course, if you also remember the film Brainstorm, which was Natalie Wood's last film before she died. In fact, she died halfway through the filming of the making of the film. But the idea was they could actually capture entire experiences and then sort of play them back through this sort of neural interface. Well, the beginning edge of that stuff is sort of here. The bits and pieces of it are there. And I can tell you from personal experience that there are some labs, some military research that has gone way beyond this, and they really are looking at this idea of being able to control robotic machines at a distance with your thoughts and this whole genre of stuff. So that's like the beginning edge of this process, but that's still using traditional methods to detect electrochemical events as they occur in your brain in a kind of a three-dimensional or holographic kind of in situ environment. The next step is to go beyond that and to get into sort of quantum entanglement business, because there, if you look at how quantum entanglement works, I mean, let me give an example. The first proven example of this, by the way, was in Zurich, at the IBM research facility in Zurich. This goes back about 12, 13 years now. But the idea was you could take photons and split them in half. And I won't explain all that because it takes too long, but they split photons in half, sent them down opposite ends of a fiber optic cable, many, many miles apart. And then when they rotated one part of the photon, the other photon would respond exactly the same way in real time with no delay whatsoever. Now think about that for a minute. This is actual hard science where you transcended the speed of light, where things happen as if they are exactly connected with no separation of time at all over very large areas of space. And in fact, Einstein talked about this in what he called spooky physics, and that's sort of a little lecture by itself. But if you do a little reading in what's called special relativity, you find a whole sort of dissertation on this concept. Well, more recently, encryption systems, speaking of crypto once again, have been designed and built on this very principle. In fact, there's a company called Magic Technologies. They gave a talk at when I was chairing these nanophotonics electronics conferences. I used to belong to something called Nano Tech, and we put on conferences, and a couple of them actually were held at NASA at Moffett Field. And so one of those conferences, the head of the chief scientist from Magic Technologies came in and gave a demonstration. And now you can actually buy, for a certain amount of money, you can actually buy a level 5, NSA approved, top of the line crypto system using quantum entanglement of photons over some length of distance. And the actual distance is classified, but let's just say you can be very far away and have these photonic packets linked through quantum entanglement as an encryption system. So I mean, that shows how robust and how solid this science really is. So now that has already been sort of established, the most recent thing suggests that neurons not just only have sodium ion transduction across the synaptical center interface, but there are photons that occur. And this is a big deal. This is a very recent development. So in the kind of world of neurophotonics, believe it or not, there's a lot of thought that has gone into saying, well, why are neurons, when they do this electrochemical exchange, why are there photons involved? What would photons have to do with anything? Well, here's a potential answer. Let's just say for a moment that empathic interaction really works. Let's just say that this is a scientific thing. And what's interesting is, if one goes backwards in time, virtually every civilization on the planet, and all the major continents, Pacific Islands, and just about everywhere you went, 3 basic tenets were always consistent with the spiritual mythos or the kind of culture of the time. All living things are interconnected, life comes beyond the human body, and that in many cases they saw the planet sort of like a living system that we're connected to. Now, I'm not going to say these are random thoughts or just people sitting around making things up, but why would it be so consistent, so ubiquitous across all boundaries of language, race, ethnicity, etc.? The same exact phenomenon every time was seen as like the central theme of life, as it were. There must be something to this. And so now here we are thousands of years later, and we are building instruments that can sort of measure this process. So it does suggest something's there, okay? So if that's the case, we've already shown that photonic entanglement really works, and we can use it for crypto systems and other things which I won't mention. And now that we're beginning to discover that there's a photonic aspect to neurochemistry, well, doesn't that suggest perhaps, just maybe, that there's a kind of a biophysical, quantum physical interface that happens with one's thoughts, with one's intention?
Right.
And that's what Roger Nelson was trying to establish with his experiments. And of course, there's been a lot of other folks, Rupert Sheldrake's probably the most well-known, who's done a lot of experiments where they've had bacteria in dishes and they've had, microbes moving around as a function of thought, all kinds of things like this. So the point is, if we're about to tap into that area of science, and now that we have nanotechnology available to construct things at the molecular scale of precision, you can build devices using certain kinds of organic molecules. There's a chip I have in mind for this purpose that can actually show these things as they occur. Could we not at some point begin to attach this directly to humans in some way to build a kind of not just an interface like where you wear a sensor on your head and you can think a thought and make a device move around, but rather your thoughts would actually entangle other thoughts as a collective process. That's the next big thing in science, in my humble opinion. The flip side of that coin says, could it be used for something terrible? Yeah, probably so. But like every other technology that we've ever come across in our history as a civilization, it's like a tool. You take a hammer, you can build a house with a hammer, you can bonk in somebody's head with it. Same exact deal in this case, only it's a much larger scale. But that's the next step in our ladder, as I say today.
Wow, that is a head full. And so how would you like to entangle with somebody else's thoughts right now, Charles?
Wait, if I... Okay, hi there.
Hold on. I actually have a caller. I have a caller that's called in. I believe it's from New Mexico, if I can recognize the area code. You're on the air. What's your name, and what would you like to talk to Charles about?
Oh, no. No, the computer was staticky, so I called so I could hear. Hi, Charles. I'm enjoying listening to you. I wasn't planning on saying anything, though.
Well, that's all right. Go ahead and speak your mind. It's fine.
That I'm Tamara. Hi.
This is Charles. This is my friend T2 down in New Mexico.
Oh, cool.
And she's incredibly bright, a researcher in her own right. And if you want to entangle with someone's consciousness,
by all means,
feel
free to entangle, dear. I mean, I've been to Mexico many times. It's a wonderful place. It's very beautiful, and I was just there actually last year, and I gave a talk at something called the Tesla Tech Conference, which is
Charles, she's a wonderful node. So let's hear what she has to say.
Cool. Yeah, please, by all means, go for it.
Yeah.
You're putting me on the spot again, Robert.
I know.
That's okay.
I really just wanted to hear the static on the internet was, I don't know what.
Yeah, there is something bad. Yeah, I must say, that every couple of minutes there was a burst of static, so it might be Skype or something, but it was kind of fuzzy there for a bit.
Yeah, so I shut the thing off and I went, okay, I won't hear the show, and then I went, no, I want to hear the show, so I'll just dial in. So I've missed some of it because of the static, but anyway, what do you want to talk about?
Well, was there any particular
I wasn't aware that you were, so this is a problem. The static piece is a problem that I incur when I have, people of note on my show. And I've talked to Blog Talk Radio about it. And unfortunately, they go home after like 4 o'clock East Coast time on Sunday. And the only way that I can bring it to their attention is if they are there in the office while I'm actually doing this show. And unfortunately, they're not there. So, we tend to have these moments while, they're away from the office. And I apologize for that. And I hope that it hasn't kept other people away from listening to the show, Tamara.
It's hard to hear. It's hard to follow the conversation online. Do you record it without the static?
I do. Yeah, there's a podcast for this. And all my shows are archived. And you'll have to get through the third eye splitting white noise moments. But once you do,
you can't record it without that, like from your house.
Unfortunately, no. This is all happening in real time. So whatever happens, happens. I have no control over it.
This is reality radio.
Yeah, staticky empathy. It's cool.
Well, it's a bit of that chaos coming through.
So Charles, go ahead, Charles.
I don't know. I think your friend is about to ask something.
Well, no, I was going to say that Tamara. I want to fill it like just a little bit of the sort of the backhoe here on Tamara. Tamara
Okay.
is a researcher in her own right.
Okay.
And Tamara has spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours working the Freedom of Information channel pipeline, particularly around ET stuff. Am I right, Tamara?
Okay.
Well, the remote viewing thing is what I worked on really, and that was kind of a quirk when they finally released all that.
Mm-hmm.
It was on 14 CDs just dumped out willy-nilly with file names that were like 16 or 18 digits. They made no logical sense. And so when I started looking through the information, I thought, well, I'd like to come back to this document. It's a 300-page book, on Qigong or whatever. But there was no way to really remember what was where. So I started just making an annotated index. And I didn't realize how much information was there. It was quite a large project, but it was all anomalous cognition, anything the government pulled together in that program.
Well, I will say for others that I've known personally who actually have worked with Freedom of Information Act research, they make it complex on purpose. You have to actually know the exact the exact reference numbers and the search criteria. Otherwise, you'll never find what you're looking for. And they do it on purpose, by the way. That's not by accident.
Oh,
so
I know. It was clear that they did that on purpose, and so I just said, well, I'm going to take the time and make it useful to people. And,
well, in your search for remote viewing, there's also something called remote influencing, which is kind of what Robert and I were just talking about a few minutes ago.
Right.
Did you find anything that you found particularly noteworthy that you sort of came to mind as the
to be
most
frank,
or something like that?
Most of what I saw in there, I guess just because of my own background and years of meditating. I mean, I heard about remote viewing rather late. It was 2002. And, I had my own experiences in studying, neurobiology, and I'm pretty empathic. What I found in there, in a lot of ways, seems superficial to me. And
well,
they redacted a lot. So as far as remote influence, you'd have to sort of read between the lines, like some of the Chinese documents that got transcribed, into English. Some of that would be there. There was one really cool thing about how the Chinese were training children to see through their hands or see through.
I've heard this before. In fact, Ed Davis talked about this at length. So he verified the exact same thing.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff in there, but you almost have to be, meticulous and read into it from prior knowledge or from other things. And so, but
I think you're on the right trail. If I could just throw this one in there. Back in the days when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, we had our team here. There was a group of folks at SRI, Stanford Research International, just a few miles from where I live, and Russell Targ and some other folks are Hal Puthoff and that collection of folks. And I know these guys. I've actually talked to them many times. They were part of that team. And then, of course, they got defunded, or that's what they say. And I've talked to Russell. He's quite old now, but he's still active in this kind of thing.
He's a sweetie.
And he's an interesting guy. But the point I wanted to make was, when the Soviet Union dissolved, they had a huge, like I was saying to Robert in the past hour, they had a huge surplus of research, people and scientists and technical teams, including this area of research. And China was very big on sort of, buying these guys up. After with Yeltsin and everything, and the economy was in complete free fall, China and the U.S. were sort of in a race. It was almost like Project Paperclip after World War II, sort of that kind of thing, but in the modern version. And so I was just telling Robert, I had worked with something called the IPP, Initiative for Proliferation Prevention, and we actually got a lot of their nuclear and sort of rocket scientists to our side.
Wait a minute, I can't think as fast as you said that. Initiative for Proliferation Prevention, or IPP. Look it up on the web. You'll see a lot of research materials on that. So the whole point was, and my background's in energy research and material science, so I did a lot of work with former Soviet military scientists who came here to translate their expertise into things that were more interesting, like wind turbines and fuel cells and that kind of stuff. But in the meantime, China was really big on buying up the scientists they could find. And since our side didn't seem to have much interest in remote viewing, quote unquote,
China was very much on top of this. In fact, they absolutely did everything they could to court and get as many of these Soviet scientists as they possibly could. So it's completely logical and reasonable that China would be probably the largest purveyor of the sort of militaristic or militarized version of this. And that's exactly what they're doing. And so your research does verify that quite.
Yeah, and that explains why what I saw coming out of China in all those documents really was of most interest to me. Not that put-offs. I mean, there was good stuff. Targan put.
Yeah,
there
of course.
were some good papers.
Yeah.
But the Chinese stuff was like, all right, they're really laying it out here of, things that I've experienced and understand. Coming from the other side, coming from the meditative side, of powers of mind stuff. But I would just love to see it all come together. It's good to know you're a material scientist.
Well, I would too, and I'll give you a clue that might be sort of interesting. There's a class of proteins called rhodopsins, and they're quite commonly known in nature. You can also find rhodopsins in the fovea of the human eye. Rhodopsins are a photoreactive protein. And the reason I make that point is because if one wanted to make a chip or a device that would indicate quantum entanglement via a photonic interaction, that would be one of the chemistries worth looking at. And so when I was actually talking to Russell Targ about 6 years ago now, I was at a remote viewing conference in Nevada, and there he was giving a talk. So I said to Russell afterwards, I said, well, by the way, I'm looking at certain chemistry techniques as a way to get at this process. Which chemistry did you think of looking at? And the first thing he said was rhodopsin. So this kind of suggests there's something to it. So I'm going to guess that there are people building devices now based on a biochemical sort of nanobiological approach using some kind of rhodopsin-based chemistry as a potential detector or interface.
Can you hear me?
Just barely. It's a lot of static.
That static's really awful, but I wrote that down. I'll research that. I only heard bits of what you were saying.
Okay.
But rhodopsin, is that what? R-O-D-I?
Yeah, actually it's R-H. R-H-O-D-I-S-T-I-N.
R-H-O-D-O-S-I-N?
Yeah, rhodopsin. R-H-O-D-I-T-I-N. Rhodopsin.
Charles, Tamara's one of my Facebook friends. And you guys, what's really interesting, I just want to interject here for a moment. When I first met Tamara online, it was in conjunction with ions.
Oh, right.
Really?
That's
right.
Cool.
Yeah, this is actually a funny story, and if we can cut through the static.
Oh, by all means, go for it. Why not?
So, I'm friends with Dean Radin on Facebook.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And so Dean had posted this very innocuous post about eating a donut.
Eating a donut, okay.
Yeah, eating a donut. And, he
was just saying he enjoyed this donut he just ate.
It was very innocuous. He enjoyed this donut.
Okay.
So I guess there are these ions, groupies that got on there, and they were taking Dean to task about eating this donut.
And being a bad influence on all of us followers.
Oh my gosh, heaven forbid
that can't think for ourselves, and we'll eat donuts too.
Well, as a sideline, just if I can burst in, when I was working here at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, I was there for about 10 years. I used to work at night sometimes because that's when they would turn the accelerator on and had these big experiments. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'd head down the hill to a place called Dream Fluff Donuts. I'm not kidding. At 3 o'clock in the morning, they had their first batch of glazed donuts, in the bubbling pot of oil or whatever. And I get them as they were hot. They just pull them right out of the thing. And boy, I was hooked. That was a hardcore donut addict. So I had my donut days.
So Dean had his donut moment, and these guys, they were like the food Nazis. And
they were. And so Robert and I were really like, come on, let Dean be human, for God's sake. And what scientist doesn't eat sugar and coffee?
Now, I have a story for you guys. Now, listen to this. This is for real. I'm not making this up. There's a company in Japan. They make a toilet that has sensors in the toilet, and it can detect from your excrement, as it were, what you're just eating, and it'll give you back a physiological report. So just imagine now a world in the future where your health care costs would be tied to the detection that comes out of your toilet, and they would say, you've had too much pizza tonight, or you've had too many donuts, and therefore we're going to charge you an extra fee for you. There is a sort of potential for that kind of thing. I just thought I'd throw it in there just for the heck of it.
How
It is true.
That's TMI on too many levels, Charles.
Maybe a scary thought. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
This was supposed to be a serious show, but who knows? I don't know.
Anyway, Tamara and I were not Facebook friends at the time, but we bonded over this donut moment, and we've become really good Facebook friends.
Well, see, there you go.
And you know what it was? What Robert clearly was like me. It's like when you have interest in similar things. I'm interested in things Dean is too, but I don't follow. And here's this woman like, oh, you'll be a bad influence. You have to, be the epitome of perfection. It's like, cut him a break. He's human. And Robert was just the same way, And I think, I really appreciate that. I wish everybody was like that.
Actually, the last time I talked to Dean was about a year and a half ago, and we have a common friend named Beverly Rufus who does a lot of research into remote healing, that kind of stuff. And she was telling me that where Dean Radin has gone off to, he now works with a group that produces chocolate. And apparently they do some kind of remote healing thing, and the chocolate will give you better energy or something. Something kind of bizarre, but that's something he was involved in.
Oh, man. Chocolate and donuts.
That's right. That's right.
This is what it's coming down to, really. Enlightenment is a chocolate donut, really.
Right.
See, I like chocolate glazed myself.
That's what I'm talking about.
Chocolate inside, God.
Chocolate glaze. So, Charles, now Tamara knows another Charles, and one of the first emails that we kind of corresponded on was, do you know who Charles Ostman is? I actually asked Tamara that, and she said no. And so now here we are, months down the line, and we're all kind of, converging, in this sphere together. And I think it's great that you called, Tam. I really appreciate you.
Well, it's wonderful to meet you, Charles.
Likewise. And if feel free to send me emails or something. We'll have a chat, and if you want to, you can go to my website. It's historianofthefuture.org. Historianofthefuture.org or .com, either one. I actually work for an institute called Institute for Global Futures, and that's actually a very serious
I want to come work with you. How cool.
Yeah, it is kind of cool. I also work at something called the Millennium Project, which is based in Washington, D.C. And Millennium Project is a little bit different. There they look at what's called the 15 Great Challenges of the World, and they publish a global state of the world book, and I'm actually in this thing, like 4 different issues. And the point is we look at very serious situations like water, energy, biomass, all kinds of things that affect the quality of life and the political consequences thereof. Whereas Global Futures is a little more specific on sort of like the business side of how science and technology affect economic processes and that kind of thing. So, but most of my work's kind of serious. A lot of it's classified actually, but so I'm not sure if you get a job there. But there is actually quite a growing interest in being able to look at a sort of a broader, what I call holographic way of looking at the world, and this is actually a good thing. And just for your own interest, you might want to look up at this. There's something called the NIBIC, or Nano Biocognitive Convergence Conference, and this is actually sponsored by NIH, National Institute of Health, and also the NSF, National Science Foundation. And every year they have this. I've been to 3 of these things so far, and every year they bring in sort of the best of the best, the Nobel laureate level people who work in areas like neurophysiology and different aspects of material science and all these kind of things to see how these things fit together as a kind of a large puzzle, like a hologram. Because everybody's realizing that any one of these sciences by themselves only has a certain value. It's when they're put together into a larger framework that it has real value, and that's the context. And what's interesting is that it's headed by a guy named Mihail Rocca, who also was the director of the National Nanotechnology Initiative, or NNI, which I also worked for at one point. And the point was that I remember talking to Mihail at one point, and I said, the science is actually less of an issue than the social structures, because for many, many years, and I'm sure Robert will probably agree with this, in academia and also in private industry, you had these very separate, like ivory towers, these kind of vertical domains where the science was headed by a handful of powerful people, and they would kind of dictate policy and so on. And I said, Mihail, if we're ever going to be able to get into the world of nanotechnology and be able to apply it in a fruitful way, the first thing you got to do is not the science, but rather this organization of getting these what had been separate groups to be much more collaborative and sort of interfacing in a common way. And so that was the actual initial charter of the NNI. And in a way, nanotechnology was a very good instrument for catalyzing that kind of level of cooperation. So that's one of the really good parts of the NNI and the whole concept of nanotechnology in general. But if you want to get a sense of that mindset, people who work in these areas, look at something called the NIBIC, or NBIC. Just type it into your search term, and you'll get a bunch of stuff about that, and that would be sort of interesting.
When is their conference?
Well, let's see. They have one in New York. The ones I went to were here in California. One at UCLA, one was here in San Francisco, and the third one I don't remember where it was. But they're all three of them in California. But they also have them on the East Coast. They have them each year at a different location. So 2 years ago it was in New York, and I don't remember where last year it was. But anyway, if you just look at the website, they'll give you the schedule for the future conferences.
Oh, well then. You guys want to put me back on the hold thing so I can...
I'm going to put you back on mute, and then I'm going to try to get a few concrete tidbits of information out of Charles, if that's possible, in the next few minutes. But T2, thank you for calling in. I really appreciate it. And I kind of had a feeling that you and Charles would have some connection here. And, I would follow up on this offline and, see where it takes you to static land. Okay?
Sounds like we have a lot of common interests. Oh, great. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Be well. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Tamara. See you later.
Okay.
Bye. So that's one of my Facebook pals, and she's what was really interesting is I actually queried her early on in my connection if she knew you, and here she is, and so
things happen.
Yeah, here's okay. So look, I understand why you've been on Coast to Coast so many times over the years now.
I think like 12 times now.
12 times, because you
12 times
you have a lot to say. I mean, look, I could talk to you for the next 2 or 3 hours, Charles.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. And what's funny is I'm one of the few people that goes on there. I'm not selling anything. I'm not selling a book. I'm not selling a CD or anything.
But the subject matter opens a lot of trap doors.
Yeah, and that's good.
It's like trap basement doors, not trap. You open the door and you crawl down and you're down a rabbit hole. And I understand why Art and George have had you on the show numerous times over here, because there's so much to talk about and there's so much to cover and there's only so much time. So with the amount of time that we have left, I really have a couple of really pressing questions.
Please, go for it.
Okay, so people have because I put the word out that we were going to have this conversation tonight, and people wanted me to ask you about microchipping.
Okay.
Specifically as it related to the health care bill.
Yeah.
And I have to kind of, serve the needs of the Vox Populi.
No, that's okay. Listen, I know the company well. They have a chip called a Digital Angel, and they're based in Florida. I've actually talked to their CEO. I mean, I know that whole story. And the original thought was it was seen as a security measure. The idea was to use it for prisoners and maybe people with dementia, things of that nature. And then various government agencies abroad, actually, like Mexico, for instance, had all their diplomatic people who have these chips embedded. Okay, so that was the first one. Then the next one was to go to the military, so that instead of having your dog tag around your neck, it would be embedded in your skin, that kind of thing. And actually, there's a number of reasons why this actually does have some validity to it. However, the flip side of the coin says the microchip be used as a required ID tag. In other words, at a future point, that becomes your social security number, as it were. That becomes your data point, so that it's no longer numbers you type on a screen, but rather the thing that you physically have inside you is the thing that verifies who you are. Could that really become possible? That's more of a policy question than a technology. Technology question is yes, it could be done. The real question is, will it be done? And that's more of an open. I don't know the whole answer for that. I think in certain parts of the world that probably will become the case, but I'm not sure what's going to be here.
Okay. All right. So again, here coming at you from sort of the X-Files.
That's fine. No, please. That's all right.
Angle. So I want to talk about chemtrails for a second. And there's a great amount of debate in the world as to whether or not chemtrails exist. I personally have an opinion. I think they do exist. Whether or not it's being validated on a high level, Dennis Kucinich confessed to me that they're real on a one-to-one basis. So, either Dennis is nuts, which some people might say he is, or Dennis.
Well, I've seen them myself. I remember driving through, because I used to go to L.A. almost every week. I used to commute there, believe it or not, for some project I was working on. And so sometimes I drive, sometimes I fly, but in many cases I drove because I had friends that drove down there with me. And I remember going to the Central Valley sometimes and just seeing these like checkerboard patterns in the sky and going, that's kind of bizarre. And I have a lot of friends who are pilots, and I actually deal with this flying myself, private planes. I mean, I sort of know a little bit about traffic patterns. And when you're in the air, there's something called a WAC chart. It's a map for there's highways in the sky. I mean, any commercial airliner pilot will tell you there's certain corridors that you fly down. You sort of know where all the typical flight patterns are. And so you see these patterns in the sky that didn't correlate with any of the known sort of flight corridors, as it were. And so you wonder, well, what is that? Why is it there? And, I don't know what it is exactly. I don't really claim to have any inside knowledge, but just as an anecdotal sort of way, I have seen things in the sky that weren't typical flight patterns, sort of pathways. And also, the stars that I saw had a really high persistence. In other words, when you see a contrail, which is just condensation from the exhaust of the jet engine, it dissipates pretty quickly. Well, things would stay up there for a long time, like, for a half an hour or more. And that's kind of strange. And then they would dissipate and kind of spread out and become like this filmy layer across the top of the sky, as it were, up in the stratosphere sort of thing. And you have to wonder why, what would that be? I mean, there's no, it's not water. Like I said, water vapor would dissipate rather quickly, especially up at those altitudes. Whereas this stuff would sort of stay there for a while, as if it had some other material, some kind of material that was designed to be consistent over some length of time. So why would that be there? Well, all kinds of folks would have reasons. Some folks think it might be some sort of climate control thing, who knows. Folks thought it might be a way for testing for certain biologicals. I don't really buy that one because that is too diffuse. For biologicals, you need to have pretty well-contained target zones, and then you sort of test for the response in these target zones. So that's not really a good explanation. I don't know what the explanation would be. The only thing I can think of, and there's one area that does make sense, there have been some experiments where different materials are sprinkled into the sky, usually around the edge of the ionosphere at very high altitude, as a way to create a mirror for radio waves. And this relates to HARP, actually. The whole idea of, and for those that know about the history of HARP, the original reason that HARP was developed, and there's a bunch of HARPs around the world by not just this one HARP, but I mean, the reason this thing was developed was really back in the early days, if you recall, before satellites were really common as they are now, there really was no way to see over the horizon in terms of radar. So there was a big desire to come up with over-the-horizon radar, and so one of the concepts was to sprinkle certain metallic materials in the air and then be able to bounce, a radar wave off those materials and then be able to see something across the horizon line. And then, of course, other experiments were conducted, and one of the real drivers for this was the SALT II treaties, and the reason that was interesting was because, as you may recall, in the so-called nuclear triad, you have submarines, missiles in the silo, and then bombers. And in the case of the bombers and the missiles in the silos, you have a direct chain of command where you cannot launch unless you have the correct codes and you have bidirectional interface with your command, central command, as it were. Whereas in the submarines, because there really was no way to communicate with them at the time, there were certain circumstances where the commanders of the submarines could initiate a launch on their own if they felt that certain conditions were met. And when the SALT II treaties were in the midst of being developed, both sides realized that, hey, wait, we have to have a direct chain of command to control launch from submarines the same way we have with our silos and with our bombers. So we need to develop a technology that can be proven as a reliable mechanism for communication. So once again, HARP came into the picture, and the whole idea was to be able to bounce these very specialized collimated beams of radio waves off the ionosphere and then down to a submarine around the world somewhere and be able to communicate with it. So that kind of worked. But as an unexpected consequence, it was discovered that when they did this with these collimated radio beams, you also created a hotspot. And so the term ionic heater became sort of the common jargon of the day. And then it became known that, what else can you do with this? And so the Soviets actually thought about weather control, because in their world, their vision was to be able to change the direction of the jet streams over various areas of Siberia so they could grow crops there, because they had this gigantic landmass that they couldn't really use it for anything. However, once they began experiments with this, they began to realize that the amount of energy required to create enough of a contiguous hotspot to cause jet streams to change around, it was way too costly, wouldn't really be practical. But even if they couldn't do that, there were other things you could do with this. And so both sides then said sort of like a war of sorts, and not war, but they had like a contest, see who can come up with the most clever way to create ionic hotspots and do something interesting with it. So that's kind of how that evolved. So there's one argument that could say that possibly spraying these mists up in the upper atmosphere could be part of some kind of HARP-like experiment. That's one plausible thing I could think of that might make sense, but I don't know. I'm just guessing at that point.
Well, that was a really candid dissertation. I appreciate that.
Well, I'll just tell you what I know and what I don't know.
No, it was a candid dissertation. I appreciate that. I really do.
All right.
Yeah, no, truly. So what would happen if the Chinese had this and they wanted to transform the entire topography of the Gobi Desert? I mean, that would be...
Well, yeah, and here's a thought for you. And by the way, I do believe that weather wars are happening. I have actual photographs here that I've gotten myself from various sources that actually show. Now, here's how this would really work. If you were going to, for instance, use a storm as a offensive weapon, that's kind of how you might see it. You're not going to create a storm from scratch. That's ridiculous. The amount of energy required is huge. There's no way to create it synthetically. However, if there's already a storm in progress, and all you're trying to do is move it around a little bit, that's actually fairly easy to do. If you had a concentrated enough, sort of, again, the right frequency and the right thermal pattern, you could sort of lower the storm. You could sort of push it around a little bit. Because really what a storm thrives on is differential in temperature. If you have warm water versus cold atmosphere, then you have the right combination of events and the storm forms, and there you are. And so storms tend to follow these thermal patterns as they occur in the ocean, and then due to atmospherics, when you come to a landmass, then of course the land is a different temperature and the storm begins to dissipate. But if the idea was you wanted to create damage, like for instance Katrina. I mean, just think about this for a minute. Here you had our major seaport. You had this huge facility. That's where all of our oil facilities are, center refineries and so on. All of a sudden you had this killer storm that sort of made this like left turn right there, like on target. Some folks had theorized maybe that was an experiment. Maybe that was something to sort of show that this could be done. Well, as it turns out, and you may know about this already, but several years ago, in the eastern part of the world, they're called cyclones. And various parts of Malaysia, of course, had some really bad cyclones. And so at one point, a group of Russian scientists, again, these former Soviet scientists from the military labs, actually made an offer to Malaysia and said, look, we know that you're having a lot of trouble with these cyclones causing harm to your seaports and so forth. For a fee, we will change the course of a cyclone and steer it out to sea so it won't hurt your facilities. And people thought about this, and it actually was almost like to the edge of signing deals. But then the reason it was not approved was not because it couldn't be done scientifically, but because of liability potential. Because as you probably all know, weather is the most chaotic system that we know of. It has the most variables, and by far is the most complex system of interdependent variables that exist that we can possibly try to model or understand. And so even if you manage to steer a cyclone away from a place where it caused damage, the side effects or the consequences of steering a storm around might cause even more damage elsewhere in the world. And so assurance companies, these are companies who assure insurance companies, the people that underwrite, large bank loans, and sort of the major economies of the world rely on these sort of large insurance systems, like AIG, for instance, one of the big insurance companies that failed, right?
Right.
That's what they do. They assure for these kind of things. So they said, look, there's no way we could analyze the risk potential of underwriting something like this, and therefore we're not going to go along with it. So even though scientifically, all parties agreed it was an interesting idea, it was because of liability reasons that they decided not to go through with it. But the fact that it was even made as an offer and that, the various technical folks were ready to go, it kind of showed this was a possible thing. This was several years ago. So more recently, last year, in Beijing, there was a moment where the sky turned black. In the middle of the day, it was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sky turned black. There was a horrific hailstorm. I mean, horrific hailstorm. And
Didn't they have snow? Didn't they have snow, Charles?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello?
Didn't they have snow?
I'm sorry, excuse me, one more time, please?
Didn't they have snow in Beijing?
Well, they had snow, but the thing was, the sky turned black, and hail, you have to understand what hail is. I'm sorry. Hail is not snow. Hail is water that's recycled vertically up and down inside these huge cumulus clouds. And if you ever see these like big, they're called anvils, these big black clouds that are sort of flat on top, and then they go up in many thousands of feet into the atmosphere. The reason they're shaped that way is because you have a vertical cyclone inside where the winds are stirring around in this vertical vortex, and so you have chunks of ice, and they fall a certain distance, and they get swept back up, and they get more ice wrapped around them. So when you get hailstones falling out of the air, especially if they're large, that means that they have an incredibly powerful vertical cyclone going on, up to 20,000 feet. And so here you had the city turning black, and then about 200 miles away you had this incredible hailstone, like one of the largest hailstones ever witnessed in human history. And several thousand people were killed. I mean, houses were flattened and there were deaths. I mean, it was a pretty big deal. And China tried to cover it up, but it was, kind of a major thing. The thing that I thought was kind of interesting was, if you recall when the Olympics were happening in China, it was daily, and I still have the article here on my computer somewhere, and they very proudly said, we are going to prevent rain and clouds from disturbing our summer games. And they bragged about the fact they had enough weather control equipment to guarantee perfect weather for the games. This was China's through their people's daily as a public statement. So that kind of suggests, gee whiz, that, and by the way, I've got some space shuttle photographs, and I'll send you one in the email if you wish, and you can actually see there's a perfect hurricane going on, with the eye of the hurricane, and right at the very edge of the hurricane there's a square, like a rectangular-shaped chunk of clouds, like a hole being cut through the clouds. A perfect textbook signature of a collimated radio beam, doing something with a cloud formation. So, So, in other words, this is kind of a done deal. So, one of the things that kind of scares me. Oh, and by the way, two other things I should mention. There was several events here in the United States. One in Minnesota, by the way, right up near the Canadian border, where the jet stream came down to the ground, and millions of trees were flattened. I mean, torn up, roots up, and everything. 200-mile-an-hour winds scouring across the surface and disappeared again. The theory is that this is one of our tests, and there had been an earlier event in Wisconsin, and it was out in the wheat fields, but it did cause some damage, and there was a lot of insurance claims, and so they decided to do the next experiment out in the middle of nowhere in the Minnesota-Canadian border area, so there wouldn't be any, liability damage. So there's evidence that we were trying some of this stuff, and there's lots of evidence that China is doing this stuff, and obviously the Russians were doing this as a business maneuver. So it's kind of obvious that weather manipulation is a doable deliverable, as it were. It's a commodity. Now, could that be part of a potential offensive, strategic sort of asset to play with in the future? Yeah, certainly could be. Could some of the climate change we're witnessing be an artifact of some of these tinkerings? Could be. In other words, I'm willing to go as far as climate change is quite real. Yes, of course it is. Is carbon part of it? Yes. But I think there's other parts of it that may or may not be for public knowledge, and that could be part of that puzzle.
Well, that's a pretty interesting revelation, and I'm on that bus with you because what ultimately, right? What is the ultimate power? It's control the environment of the planet. I mean, this is theoretically.
Well, here's where it gets more interesting. If you're going to cause damage to an economy, and you have to remember back in the days of the Cold War, we did a lot of stuff to the Soviet Union, and they tried to do stuff to us, not just with rockets and that kind of thing, but we did things like, for instance, we knew that they were stealing our software. So there's one example. There's a company here in Silicon Valley, which I won't name, but they're one of the major producers of embedded controllers for refineries and for controlling valves and pipelines, that kind of thing. And we knew that the Soviets were sort of sneaking around trying to get their hands. So we set up a deal. I didn't set this up, but I just know that people had arranged this. They allowed some of these chips to get stolen with this firmware on the chips. And they brought it back to the Soviet Union because they were building this giant pipeline out of Azerbaijan, or I think it was somewhere in that area. And they had this, it was a natural gas pipeline with this huge sort of, facility with tanks and everything. Well, apparently the software had bugs, which we knew about. They used the software, and the largest non-nuclear explosion ever recorded in history was when that facility blew up, and we saw it with our satellites as a result of the purposeful sabotage that we caused by letting them steal these chips. I mean, this kind of stuff happens. So in a way, if you're going to, economic warfare is really the name of the game in terms of superpowers battling each other. It's not going to be with, ships and tanks and that kind of thing. It's really going to be through much more subtle means, through incurred debt, as we were talking about earlier, and through changing the playing cards, as it were, in terms of who has the upper hand in terms of the world economy. And so one way to do that would be to cause crop failures or to drastically change the patterns of weather over certain areas where it might affect your potential economic health in the future, your export potential, that kind of thing. So could there be an argument that says that there's been this ongoing battle by invoking climate change in certain ways that would cause, economic harm? And so if you want to walk that path, and I'm just saying as a theoretical idea, could the chemtrails be a way to prevent that from happening? In other words, if we knew that things were kind of funny going on, could we be using some kind of particulate matter in the upper atmosphere to lessen the effect of these alterations of the jet stream, that kind of thing? That's a possible argument. It's not one that I know for a fact, but it's a possible argument.
Well, that certainly might be the most altruistic argument, or a rationalization for the use of chemtrails. But, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, for sure. We're winding down here on our time, and I just want to say that I have thoroughly enjoyed, having you on the show, Charles. And
I certainly do too.
One of the cool things about, not just about what I'm doing here, but about life in general, is that I first got to know you in 1996, 1997, and you and I went through a number of of interesting, experiences with
I think the word interesting will sum it up quite well. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and driving down the coast to L.A.
Oh
and
yeah.
like that, and and the thing that I always really appreciated about you is just you, and being able to connect with you and have this really kind of free flowing interchange of ideas and communication, and it's great to know that even though you and I have not talked, really, it's been almost 10 years now. Am I right?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, something like that. Time flies when you're having a good time, I guess. Who knows?
But we still have this portal of dialogue between us.
Absolutely.
And I really appreciate that. And we're not that far apart, and I hope that you and I could rendezvous somewhere up in the gourmet ghetto one of these days for a cup of coffee, like the old days.
Absolutely.
And and talk just off the record, as it were. So let's get some websites for you, Charles, and
sure.
Find where people can find out more about your work and maybe where you're speaking in the not so distant future.
Absolutely. So I have several, but the one that's relevant in this context would be Historian of the Future, all one word. I'll say it again: historianofthefuture.com or .org, either one.
Okay. And any upcoming speaking dates or?
Well, actually, I just gave a talk in Los Angeles about 3 or 4 weeks ago. There's some others, but they're not confirmed yet, so I don't want to give them up. But I do put them up there once I have confirmed. So it's a work in progress.
Okay, good. But just go to Charles's website, find out what he's up to, where he's speaking.
Yeah.
Where in the world is Charles Ostman? So.
Okay.
Yeah, Charles, thank you so much again for being with me that sat through our static storm, and hopefully I'll have you back on in a couple months and get an update as to where the world is headed in this velocity cannon, this linear accelerator that we're all seem to be joined at the hip together in.
Sounds good. Take care, and we'll talk soon.
All right, you take care, Charles.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So that was Charles Ostman, and I hope that the static is not as bad as it's been reported to be on the other end of these conversations. And if there has been the static, then I hope that you've been able to sit through it and weather the storm, because there's some great information coming through. Charles is a wonderful resource, and you can always go to his website, Historian of the Future, and find out what he's up to and where things are headed. Charles is a weather vane. He is a canary in the coal mine, and what Charles shared with us tonight, he's like an iceberg. He probably shared the upper 20%. He shared the upper 20% of the iceberg, and there's a lot more beneath the surface that Charles knows about and understands and is working on that is not for discussion in the public. So when he does come out and he does share, it is really a blessing and a gift, and I really thank him for coming on. So next week we have Eric Sagelsgaard, who is the author of the 27s. It is a astrological look at many people who have departed before the age of 28. There's a big astrological angle, there's a big cultural angle, and I look forward to talking with Eric, and we'll talk more about that on Wednesday when I join you for Navigating the Astrological Matrix. My name is Robert Phoenix. You've been listening to Free Association Radio. Until next week, bye.